Okay, well, hello, Focus friends. My name's Cliff. I was on staff in the mid-90s and early 2000s. I'm just here in my office of the chapel at Monmouth School. You can see down the hill below our little town on the Wye River Valley. There's an 11th century church just there in the shadows. And here we are. But I think what I'll do is sit in front of my sort of Martha's Vineyard sort of shrine wall here. And we're going to look at Genesis 50 in a moment. We're going to look at the story of Joseph. Joseph is he's a big part of Genesis. He gets more airtime than Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, and he has a lot to teach us. He teaches us actually that gifts of administration, such as the ones that Joseph had, can be used by God in very big ways. So be thankful for your administrators in New Canaan and in your areas. Joseph's life also teaches us the very costly stupidity of a parent favoring one child over another, and by extension tells us that not every loving feeling we have should be indulged. Joseph's life, his life teaches us that if we're to grow in patience and wisdom, then it's very likely, isn't it, that the Lord is going to cause us to have that growth by waiting and through perplexing circumstances and so on. So we want to learn more actually about Joseph, but not so much, more of the Lord himself, the one who directed Joseph's steps. And the main thing we grasp about the Lord through Joseph's life is that his providential care in the events of the lives of his people, the very individual personal sufferings that we endure, as well as worldwide events. At the end of Joseph's life, we'll find a man who is leaning forward towards Jesus Christ. And that's how the New Testament understands him in Hebrews 11. So just a few verses at the end of Genesis chapter 50. You know the story of Joseph, but as an overview, his life in summary, he was someone who was favored by his father, and he told on his older brothers when they did wrong. He flaunted his gifts. And so there was an enormous strain between him and his brothers. There was hatred, there was jealousy galore. So Joseph was sold into slavery by them, age 17. And his brothers lied to cover up their crime by faking his death to the agony of their father Jacob, and they kept up that deceit for decades. In Egypt, where Joseph was sold into slavery, his hopes rose that a fresh start was possible for him in Potiphar's house, but then they were dashed as he was unjustly imprisoned. He spent much of his 20s in jail, and his hopes were raised again then, with Pharaoh's cupbearer being freed, as Joseph predicted, understanding his dream. But then Joseph had a second spike of sorrow and was forgotten for 2 more years as he languished in prison. Some people say that being given hope only to have it dashed again is worse than never having it at all. But a repeated line in chapter 39, which details Joseph's suffering more than other chapters, the repeated line is that the Lord was with Joseph, verse 2. Verse 21, again, the Lord was with Joseph. And verse 23, the Lord was with him. So age 30, the Lord was indeed with Joseph. He enters Pharaoh's service and becomes kind of a like prime minister, with the Pharaoh being king of Egypt. He was in charge under Pharaoh's command. And his miraculous gifts were used to elevate him to that power and to save not only the Egyptians, but also God's chosen people from famine, a famine which he had shown to Joseph and which the Lord himself had brought about. So Derek Thomas summarizes that chain of events this way. Joseph suffered in order that his undeserving brothers might receive blessing. So what happened was that there was a painful reunion 22 years after Joseph's brothers had so desperately wronged him. He was 17 when he was sold in slavery, 13 years of slavery in prison, then 7 years of plenty, and then his brothers show up in year 2 of the 7-year famine. And Joseph sees all of the loss and loneliness he endured, the suffering and the injustice and the seemingly pointless crying out to God. It all kind of comes together with the arrival of his brothers 22 years later. He sees what the Lord had been doing. And there's drama, kind of a soap opera, a few chapters of toing and froing, Benjamin and Judah and so forth. But the point is he's going to save them from starving, and he gives his family a home. So fast forward now to chapter 50, and Jacob's death, and his brothers worried that Joseph was going to unleash a reckoning at long last, now that their beloved father had died. So Genesis 50, I hope you have it in front of you now, is really a chapter which is full of sorrow, sin, and death. Joseph was filled with sorrow on Jacob's death. Chapter 50, verse 1. Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Well, that's grief, isn't it? That's grief right there. Sorrow on the death of his beloved father. His brothers are worried that Joseph, who now has power to take revenge, will do so. And even though he forgave them of their sin years ago, they didn't seem to accept it. And so his brothers had imprisoned and enslaved themselves with guilt for much longer than Joseph's 22 years. They say in verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back all the evil we did to him. And so they offer themselves, verse 18, to be slaves. But that was false. That's the flip side of forgiveness. It needs to be received as well as given. At the end of this chapter, Joseph himself dies. Look at verse 26. So Joseph died being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, begins with the light and life that God wills into being through his powerful word, and that first book ends with a coffin. There is sorrow, sin, and death in Genesis chapter 50. But another Bible teacher has noted that in Joseph, we see in the middle of this chapter that the Christian, both Joseph and us, can live a life of faith, hope, and love in the midst of sorrow, sin, and death. Now, just to speak about our current situation, I really, really dislike online ministry. I know as a board member for the equivalent of Focus in Britain, that the staff have had a hard time not being able to visit schools, not being able to run summer programs, being anxious about next summer, not being able to possibly run them, and so on. In my school today, just earlier today, I was writing to a colleague who lost his mother over the Christmas break. She died of coronavirus. We have boarders from overseas who arrived, and then only to find that lockdown was announced again just a couple of days ago here. Other boarders spent Christmas in their boarding houses and weren't able to go home. We can't sing in church. We can't meet up with people. I don't like COVID ministry, not one bit. But I have to say that in Britain, about 1 in 10 people in an average year go to some kind of church service. But in the coronavirus pandemic phase, 1 in 4 people have looked at a service online. It's a big change. So maybe God is at work in that way. Well, what does the Lord have to teach us about himself through Joseph? There's a commentator named Derek Kidner, and he's your go-to guy for Genesis. Tim Keller and Dick Lucas before him, their sermons are based on what Kidner has written on this, and really one sentence, one little phrase. They look at these verses, Joseph's response to his brothers. I'll read them from verse 19. But Joseph said to them, his brothers, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them, spoke kindly to them. Derek Kidner says that each sentence of Joseph's threefold reply is a pinnacle of Old Testament and New Testament faith. First, to leave all the writings of wrongs to God, to see his providence in man's malice, and to repay evil, not only with forgiveness, but with practical affection. Those are attitudes which anticipate the adjective Christian and even Christ-like. So Genesis 50, verse 19, reminds us that we are not God. Joseph had enormous power, but he knew he was not in the place of God. In this case, of being wronged by people, we're not to stand in judgment, but to leave this to God. We know from earlier that Joseph knew the Lord with him in his troubles, and so may we. But in our suffering, we are to see his providential care of us, care that also he is at work. The action might require God, that somebody is taken to cause our suffering, That might require God to punish them through the magistrate. That's a legal response. But the personal freedom of the Christian is to leave the writings of wrongs to God. It's a great relief when you're insulted or hurt by someone to pass on revenge. Secondly, we can see God's providential hand in human malice. Certainly, we're not to call evil good. Joseph twice says it's evil. And earlier he says, what you meant to bring me about for harm. When we're harmed, when things that are evil happen around us or to us, we're not to call them good, but we can say by faith that God is working in these things for the good of his people and for his own glory. Joseph's brothers meant evil, but God intended it for good. Think of the junior in high school you know, who you really enjoy seeing in ministry. And imagine that boy or girl from now until age 30 being wrongly imprisoned, being trafficked, and then put in jail. Most of those years spent with great suffering. That's not a good thing, but Joseph learned to live with God and to know God with him. Lastly, practical affection. It was in Joseph's power to help, and he does not hold back, but steps forward. Well, time's getting past. We won't unpack that anymore. But what about us? We have the message of the gospel, friends, do we not? In Focus, we are stewards of the gospel to students attending independent schools, as well as the volunteer leaders and students who are involved in universities. We have the message of the gospel, and it feels like we're being stymied right now in sharing it with kids. Additionally, I have no idea of the impact on you personally, for your family, your friends, or yourself as a result of this pandemic. What on earth is God doing? I don't know, but he is at work. He is good, and he is in control. And so in the midst of sorrow, sin, and death, we can live with faith, hope, and love. God used the terrible suffering of his son, did he not, as his perfect plan to redeem the world. He is at work in this pandemic to accomplish his purposes. The Lord wove even the dreadful sins of his creatures to bring about their salvation. That was true of Joseph's brothers, and it's true of people who crucified Jesus, and we whose sin was borne on Jesus' shoulders on the cross. So for Joseph and Jesus, God's chosen Savior proclaimed forgiveness and life to his brothers, welcomed them in place of judgment. Doesn't mean that wickedness, abuse, terror, and violence are from God. It means that he is indeed Lord of all. Psalm 119 is instructive, and we'll finish with this. You are good, verse 68 of Psalm 119. You are good, and what you do is good. Teach me your decrees. It was good for me to be afflicted, so that I might learn your decrees. I know, Lord, that your laws are righteous, and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me. May your unfailing love be my comfort, according to your promise to your servant. So may that be so for each one of us, that we would know the Lord with us and trust in his providential care of his people, because he is good. Thank you, friends.